Hey, I'm Scott,
And I'm Chris.
and this is Doxalogic, where we help you think with your Bible.
Well, welcome back to another exciting and enjoyable and enthusiastic.
Wow.
How many other E words do I have? Excellent, hopefully,
Woo!
podcast episode of Doxalogic. Scott, we are fired up about this episode, and we laugh, but I think it's true. I think I was the one that, we promote different episodes back and forth to one another, and some are like, boy, that's it. Like, that's it next month when we record, or that's it in a while. This was a that's it in a while one, in part because the truth is, as I hope we demonstrate, there's a whole lot of homework that goes into an episode like this, and of course, we are going to be getting into the history and the impact and even the response to feminism. And Scott, I asked you the question that you actually asked me, which was quite funny, in relation to this, which is this: why do we hate ourselves?
I love that you shared that because we seem to go wherever the fire's burning hottest.
Right.
So, yeah, and it's funny too because in this day and age, we're trying to be faithful to, well, picking up questions people ask on the mailbag, right, from time to time. We did a series called Now Concerning, which was dealing with key social issues and other really pressing things on the hearts of Christians, and parts of this came up. Applications of feminism came up in those sermons and those questions that were asked, and sermons that were then responses to that, and so we just think it needs to be addressed. And so now's the time. And the joke is, of course, that once we wade into this, it could very well just light up YouTube and the social media sphere that will perhaps be a little upset.
Yeah.
And
The good news is that we don't pay any attention to that.
Correct.
In all honesty, right? And so every once in a while, I have heard someone say, "Have you guys, seen such and such a mailbag or whatever that got a lot of comments or had some angry people?" And they're always like total anons, the anonymous people.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
like, no idea,
because you can be more aggressive if you're anonymous.
Yeah, well, yes. How that person even find this?
Yeah.
The algorithms of YouTube, and it is what it is out there on the interwebs. And so we're going to jump in part because, guys, listeners who we care about so much, we really do, feminism is basically the air we breathe now in America, at least, and certainly in many parts of the world. But what we hope to show you is that feminism has been around a long, long time, a lot longer than I think a lot of people realize. And we're going to give quite a bit of historical context to certain key players and key moments. And what we want to do is deep dive into the history, right? Also then evaluate ongoing cultural and political impact, some of the look of how feminism continues to impact the church at large in America, and then some response to feminism in the end, right? And so all of that, we hope, in less than an hour and 15 minutes, and we're already several minutes in. So we should begin, Scott. I want to do this. I think this is probably going to be visible on the video. This book, The End of Woman, is one of several that we consulted. Both of us read this, and there are a couple others that we'll mention. In fact, the show notes, we don't always use show notes, but show notes have got several books and a couple of key articles that just want you to know, like, for further reading, for further investigation. This book, End of Woman, is going to really be heavily used in this first long section of the history of feminism. The subtitle, which I appreciate, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. Mm-hmm. And this is written by a woman named Carrie Gress, and you can find this on Amazon, and I'm sure other such bookstores as well would very much encourage you to go get that. But maybe, Scott, let's start with a definition, and then let's get to the history of feminism.
Yes, and I think the definition is really important, and we'll be operating off of this definition the entire episode. And so another book you'll see in the show notes is a book called Honor Thy Fathers, which we thought had probably the best single sentence definition of feminism, and it's the one we're going to use today, which is that feminism is an ideology that seeks to flatten the difference between men and women, particularly in the home, the church, and the civil government. So feminism is an approach to the sexes, essentially, but it has a goal, and that is for women to become more like men. And so we're going to see that as we go. That's the issue. It's this an ideology that flattens that difference between men and women and really becomes women become eradicated.
Right.
And there's a movement to becoming like men, essentially. It undermines God's design. It degrades the role of true biblical femininity, which we'll talk about, and womanhood. And so that's the definition. When we say feminism, that's what we're saying and we mean. Now, that with the framework of a definition, we're going to work this out. And so you're going to have to come along with us on this journey. We're doing our best to condense this, but we thought that I think the historical account is truly fascinating. And so to the point of you mentioning the book, it is a very interesting read, and we're going to give you a flyover. Forgive us for that, but we're trying to connect dots as efficiently as possible to give you a good overview.
And so, to introduce this, the historical origins of feminism really go back to actually the French Revolution. And that's a lot further back than people know, and that's not an American root either, though we're going to get to the American roots of feminism, which is what we're so familiar with today. But it really does go back to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, much can be said about it, but it was an effort really to recreate and reshape society in a world without God. It was an effort to erase the sacred from society. It was a phenomenally terrible time, and I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek because the reign of terror was a part of the French Revolution in that time period. Just the horror, the death, the upheaval governmentally, and there were a lot of things coming to a head at one time, philosophically and politically in the French Revolution. But this is the backdrop of what commonly is known as the world's first feminists. The world's first feminist is often referred to as Mary Wollstonecraft. She was born in 1759, and her family kind of ends up being, if you picture, Scott, those Russian dolls, you know, where it's the big one, you take it out, and there's a little one, you take that out. There's another. There's like 5 of them. Their family is almost that version of there are layers to their family that we're not going to be able to totally even get into, but the impact. The outsized impact that this family made way beyond their lifetime is quite remarkable. Not in a positive way either. So Mary Wollstonecraft, her family life was sad. It was very sad. Father was an alcoholic, known as being just as likely to be joyful as vicious. Her mother was very aloof, little affection, was not shy about favoring the oldest child, a son that they had. Life punctuated by things like, crass cruelty, waves of poverty, immorality, and her goal as she grew into adulthood and into fame was to reshape society, to rid it of what she called male hierarchy or the, quote, tyranny of men. And she eventually befriended a radical publisher named Joseph Johnson, who published in 1792 one of the foundational works in early feminism, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And then the word feminism wasn't even being used yet, but this is historically just the beginning of the thread. So A Vindication of the Rights of Woman was, again, what made her, kind of put her on the map. She ended up with multiple marriages and multiple children, and yet she thought of the family, or wrote of it as the enemy of happiness. And it was because she saw that this unnatural enslavement to male sexuality bounded up in marriage. And she wrote in a way that was very hard to understand, especially as Carrie Gress outlines, which turns out to be very common to this day. The very difficult prose or manner of writing is hard to understand them, even if you know the language, right? It is. And yet there were 3 main points of interest for Mary Wollstonecraft. One was this: society must be fundamentally restructured away from male hierarchy. Number 2 was that women's education and the opportunities had to change. And then number 3, females really needed to be reclassified to ensure their dignity was respected. And Scott, one of the big kind of, again, threads early on, which we see really start to take off, was women as a human being not so much woman as mother or wife. A key thing, kind of put that as a stake in the ground there. Woman as human being, right? Woman as creature, not necessarily female in terms of motherhood and being a wife. This was the emphasis that over generations would start to snowball from her writings and on down into really transformative, something that quite possibly many people, she would not have actually seen what it would eventually become. But this detachment started away from woman as fundamentally the mothering, the nurturing, and then also the reality of a wife, and that was a lot of her legacy.
Yeah. It brings me back to Genesis 1, and frankly, a lot of the response to feminism should bring us back to Genesis
1 and 2 and 3.
1 and 2 and 3. But in particular, Genesis 1, on that distinction of woman as human being instead of woman as female. Right? And I think in Genesis 1:27, where, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And that sort of gets rid of that distinction, but tries to hold on to an aspect of it. But what it does is, if you start with the French Revolution and removing God from society, you're living in an atheistic worldview that then eventually gets to be created by those who are living in it, in a sense. And that's going to be some of what comes next, which is basically, if you take God out of the equation, you don't lose religion, because God has made us as worshipers. So we'll just be idolaters. And that's what you find in a key root of feminism is feminism and the occult. Feminism and the substitution of false religion is essentially what I would say, because I would say it's even bigger than the occult. But needless to say, we'll just jump into this next element, which is that feminism has been deeply influenced by the occult. It's one of the most interesting parts, I think, of my personal study on this subject. And the source and part of that, connected to Wollstonecraft's legacy, is the work of her daughter, Mary Godwin Shelley, who you would probably know as the author of the book Frankenstein, which is a Penguin classic.
Probably.
It's
very culturally popular as an idea, but guys, it is such a dark work. And not even promoting reading it as much as End of Woman is one way to understand the work, but also 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age, Rosaria Butterfield. Interestingly, that book is, first of all, got a whole section on feminism, very good. She wrote her PhD on Mary Shelley and on Frankenstein.
And that was before Christ.
Yes,
that was
she was living a lesbian lifestyle still and all of this, but she just remarks in the book, she wrote her PhD on Mary Shelley, of all people. And she was 18, maybe 19, Mary Shelley was, when she wrote Frankenstein. So there's a lot of dark philosophical, there's like tragedy and comedy in terms of themes. This is a tragedy, right? This is a dystopian book, but nonetheless.
So, you have a time period where obviously the Enlightenment is kind of significant, the emphasis of reason, and what comes after this is kind of one of the responses is Romanticism, right?
Swinging the other way.
The swinging of the pendulum, in a sense. Romantics saw the Enlightenment as being confining. That reason was being too exclusively emphasized and elevated, and they reacted with a kind of passion and emotion and a kind of spontaneity that kind of gave life and breath to this entire movement. And there was one thing that Romantics and those of the Enlightenment agreed on, and that was that there was no longer any room in the world for Christianity. And so you see this playing out. Now, again, what's funny about trying to live in a non-Christian world is this is still our Father's world. And you can deny it all you want, but it ends up coming out in so many different ways. And so one of the ways it comes out is in a complete rewriting of Genesis. So rather than maybe disregarding it altogether, there was a new created spin, if you will, that was placed upon the traditional reading of Genesis 3, right? Saw Eve's disobedience as inverting the order of creation, but Shelley will come along and make the serpent the highest authority, then make Eve the next authority, and then Adam, and then God's essentially ignored altogether. So it's a rewriting, it's a recreating. Move God out of the picture, and you can create your own version of reality, and so she'll continue to do this. Essentially, she's known for having written a poem called "The Revolt of Islam," which
Her husband Percy Shelley wrote
I'm sorry.
this, but-
Her husband wrote a poem called "The Revolt of Islam" that made God the author of evil and Satan the bringer of good. So just flipping the story of the Bible on its head. But here's an interesting thing that's going to be picked up as feminism's history goes on. She creates a heroine. Or a heroine is created called Sithna. Is that the way to say it?
Yeah, I think so.
Who is the earthly messenger of Satan, who is seen as this liberator, essentially. And Sithna kind of becomes the ideal individual. She's not connected to any kind of family. Of course, family was being seen as one of those things that needed to be,
Undermined, and dismantled.
taken
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
And that was the ideal model of womanhood that was being proposed. And so it was interesting because what was novel, as we're going to see, it was Shelley's development of this character from this poem that her husband wrote. And essentially the character would become a model for future generations seeking to define a new kind of woman devoid of family relationships. And of course, that's one of the things feminism does, is erode the family structure. And so you've got Wollstonecraft, you've got Mary Shelley, you've got feminism and the occult and just false religion being built in there, because we can't shake religion. If we don't have Christ, we're going to have something else. And that sort of sets the stage for American feminism.
Right, and so this moves us into the kind of early to mid 1800s, and spanning quite a bit of time here. But American feminism begins with two particular ladies, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. To some, those are pretty well-known names, heralded to this day as the foundresses of the women's movement in the U.S. And oftentimes we will see them portrayed, whether that's biographies or documentaries or how they're talked about as just you've used the word heroines, that they are the heroines of this movement in America. But as Carrie Grass shows, and we're only gonna get to the surface of things here, but there's a few flies in the ointment, is what she says, such that a deeper look into their lives really reveals pretty dark shades to their story. Unfortunately, their biographer is known to have burned personal papers of Susan B. Anthony, and numerous biographies leave out altogether, conveniently, but leave out their involvement and their belief in the occult, pagan elements of their worship of humanism or various philosophies, and kind of sanitize the story, right? You'll see certain things about them that are just hidden, kind of hidden in plain sight. Even I want to say it's the Smithsonian that has this particular occult object. It's a table where spirits were contacted, and it's in the Smithsonian, and they celebrate feminism and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and say nothing about what that table was used for. Just as one example,
They used to lay down on it and summon spirits.
Yes,
right?
and they would summon and commune with spirits, and kind of on the other side. And so speaking of that, though, when you're in the middle of the 1800s, you've got so many cultural and religious things going on along with feminism. You've got the Civil War is going on. You've also got the Second Great Awakening, as it's often called, particularly in the northeastern United States, where feminism in America was really taking root. And so you've got all kinds of spiritual fervor, crazes. There are cults that to this day are popular that sprang up in that time. Seventh-day Adventism, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness. There are many more that have now, gone
Died
out.
off.
Those three in particular got their start with particular people, and we've actually covered all three of those on each one of those on separate episodes, I should say, in the past. So Second Great Awakening, the Northeast United States, a time of great spiritual piety. And yet also, bizarrely, this hodgepodge where free love and promoting sexual relationships beyond or outside of monogamy is really just in the very early days starting to take root. So you've got this religion, you've got revivals, or we might call it revivalism, but also the pagan side of this, which is like capturing the desire of the human soul, because it's made by God as worshipers, but they would seek to contact the other side. Sometimes this is called spiritualism, that for a time that actually was like a word and an idea that meant something, and you can read more about this in Carrie Gress's work. But spiritualists at the core level disdained Christianity. It was more of a DIY approach to spirituality, did not need a text, that did not need just one, maybe leader or, belief in Christ and all of this. It was really actually spiritualism and women's rights over the latter part of the 18th century got woven together such that when Elizabeth Stanton was writing, one of her works was called the Woman's Bible. And it included an influence from theosophy, another time does not afford us to get into all of these movements and philosophies, but the Woman's Bible was very much core to the early American feminist movement. And one of the tenets of philosophy put forward a satanic counter myth. Again, we're getting back into, just as you already did, but they knew they couldn't capture the imagination of people without getting back to retelling our origin story, retelling, Eve is actually good, and it's a satanic attack on the patriarchy that was, so bad and evil in the Bible, male hierarchy. So the fall into sin was positive. It was gnosis, Gnosis. It was gnosis bringing. It brought knowledge and wisdom, and the snake or the serpent was a benevolent being that gave wisdom to woman. And so Stanton created this myth, and Eve is the heroine, and Satan is charitable, and all of these things. So it's an absolute distortion. We could call it a radical theology, but this was all intertwined with the early women's movement or early feminism in America.
So more occult, more spiritualism, more basically DIY religion, essentially. And that has no surprise. It's not like there's a neutral nothing behind spiritualism or DIY. There is definitely a pervasive sense of the counterfeit that the enemy does, right?
Yep.
That's coming through people that begins to twist and really flip God's word, which again is an interesting thing, because to the Christian we'd say, ground yourself in doctrine or belief, and out of belief comes behavior, right? Get that in the right order. And the same thing is true here. Recreate the story, redraw the lines, if you will, and then operate from that. Yep. And so you see that happening in all kinds of different ways. In the 1860s, the women's movement got connected to the abolition movement against slavery. And the way this kind of came together, and you see this actually still playing out with certain, alignments here, where the belief was that women and slaves, put them together, suffered from the same oppressor, the white male. And so they were kind of hitching themselves to the abolition of slavery, not unlike kind of how the homosexual movement has done that in some sense, right?
Yep. With the civil rights movement.
Yes, like the civil rights kind of movement. So that's nothing new. But you see this kind of continuing to play out. Go ahead.
Susan B. Anthony was quite racist and did not like that combination where slaves were going to get the right to vote possibly before women, and she came out against that. And there started to be a wedge driven between certain leaders where Stanton was pretty blatantly elitist and racist against these uneducated slaves having equal rights to an educated, woman or white woman. And so there were people that started splitting from her, and that was an early, maybe not split, but wedge being driven. Interestingly,
yeah. So upon Stanton's death, her coffin rested on that spirit table that we had talked about earlier that she had used to connect with spirits. And you had mentioned this, and it's interesting. You can see it at the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
But there's no history. There's not like a little blurb about how it was used or what was...
The pagan occultism, nope, all left out.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because, again,
I think it's where she wrote certain charters or certain almost constitutions. It was known to be where she wrote... Which is interesting too.
Yes.
What influence was
like
that?
Inspiration.
Yes, I think that's why it's famous.
Spirit-breathed truth, almost.
That's publicly why it's famous. Yeah. But there's so much more to it that just does not get said.
Yeah, and again, just the counterfeit to all scriptures God-breathed is immediately, of course, what comes to mind.
Right.
All right, so we're continuing on. We're in the 1900s now, guys. We're doing it. I hope you're.
I think we did pretty good. That was reasonably fast,
I hope
given
it's
how
helpful.
long it could have been. And so we've got the women's suffrage movement getting started around women having the right to vote. And what's interesting, just briefly, is that when women's suffrage was first raised, and I know if you're not familiar with women's suffrage, this is the movement about women having the right to vote. This is the 19th Amendment. Many women, in fact, most in America,
They didn't want to vote.
Opposed this women's suffrage movement. Now, why? Why would that be? Well, it was not because of indifference or apathy. It was rather they rightly understood that universal suffrage implied a shift from the household to the individual as the basic unit of society.
Okay,
and
that's big.
This is a quote coming out of another good book to recommend called Toxic Masculinity by Nancy Piercy, thank you. And so she talks about this. They understood, many women in the early 1900s, that this was shifting the household as the fundamental unit of society to the individual. It was going to atomize, right? It was going to break apart the family as the fundamental unit, and indeed it has. That's among one of the reasons, not to say the only one, but it was a strike at the family, she writes, as the self-governing unit upon which the state was built. Interesting.
Yeah, and eventually women did come around to supporting female suffrage, but the reason was because men who were not responsible for a household were given the right to vote. So men were no longer voting, no longer voted as office holders responsible for the common good of the household, but only as individuals. And so again, it was like, man, it became every man for themselves, essentially. So there's a high level of selfishness in there, and the sad tragedy of it is it kind of spurred something. And so same author Piercy said, a tragic erosion of women's trust in men to take responsibility for the common good. Step by step, communal manhood was giving way to a secular paradigm of the self-made autonomous individual, and essentially feminism kind of followed right in that path.
Right. Now, another historical reality is feminism and Marxism aligning. And so we already kind of covered the 1860s and 70s and then forward in America to the early 1900s. And yet Marxism having its roots with
Karl Marx?
I want to say Charles because of Charles Darwin.
Okay.
Karl Marx.
Yeah.
You're staring at
Yeah, I
me
was
like,
like, I don't know
get
what
it?
you want.
Get-
I don't know what you want.
Sorry, we're going on a while. Karl Marx, sorry, not Charles, but Karl Marx writing in the mid to late 1800s. And so a new set of leaders eventually arose that quite literally had a Marxist agenda. And interestingly, even the Soviet Union took a lot of these Marxist ideals such that feminism and Marxism really had a common goal. And we're skipping quite a bit of history, but just to understand the melding together of these philosophies that had religious components as well, which Marxism certainly did and still does as well. But feminism and Marxism overlapping to the degree that many historians would say they became largely indistinguishable. That any talk of women's issues, whether it be motherhood or suffering or oppressive white male hierarchy, all these things were tied in with Marxism and with feminism. So you've got Marx and his kind of comrade Engel stoking communism in the late 1800s. Capitalism is the ultimate bad guys. The poor are the oppressed, and the rich are the oppressors, and they're doing a version of Marxism then. Marxism has become much more cultural, not only political now, but eventually, again, feminism and Marxism intertwined so much that they were largely indistinguishable. And it would be important to note that even the Congress of American Women, which was set up in 1945, really was organized with Russian and French influences moving into the U.S. One quote is this: "It was really only a renewed offensive to control American women." This is speaking of the CAW, the Congress of American Women. "It was a matter of deep importance to the communist movement because they are regarded as a reserve force. Women are regarded as a reserve force of the revolution, the Marxist revolution, communist revolution, because they are more easily moved by emotional appeals. So the Congress of American Women and the Soviet agenda was stripping women over years of the emphasis of motherhood through early, but nonetheless early and free forms of abortion. And this became a type of birth control in the Soviet Union. So much so that the Soviets actually had to start to reverse course and offer incentives for women to have kids because of plunging birth rates over time as well.
Yeah, not to mention the Soviets, the whole framework was viewing women through an androgynous lens, right? So
And androgyny defined as
male or in between, the kind of in between of male female,
like no difference.
no difference. Yeah,
Atheist, no God, androgynous, the in the
Yes.
front, really no difference between male and female.
right. So sending women to work like men would work, corralling children in government care, providing, like you said, limitless abortions, and this was again going towards it, kind of defined as freedom.
Right.
You're out of your responsibilities. The rule of the family has no power over you. Limiting the effects of things like being mothers to children now is a thing. And it's all starting to tie in together with patriarchy and this idea that patriarchy, father rule, is a bad thing, and it was being used by the communists in a negative sense to say we've got to get liberation from that in a sense. And I think it was Engels that first used the language of patriarchy, which has become such a buzzword in our day.
We'll get back to that in a little bit.
People used it before, but he had really made it kind of popular. He popularized it.
We negatively popularized
Correct,
it, right?
in a negative sense, and gave us the modern understanding of patriarchy as a male system of power to control women. So that started to be, like your point, negatively defining. And it's all about words and definitions. And in order to move something forward, you have got to change the dictionary on words. So words no longer mean what they used to mean. And it again helps provide the impetus for this forward movement of feminism as it was, progressing in the mid 1900s by now.
Yeah. So another key figure. Now we're in the 1960s. Betty Friedan. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. At least you're Friedan. We'll say Friedan.
Go with it.
She wrote the Feminist Mystique. Still a very popular work in feminist literature today, presenting herself as like a simple housewife with no career ambitions and a newly formed sense of feminism. And yet again, pointing to this book, End of Woman, you'll have pages describing that really was not the truth. And there are some biographers in her life, or a key biographer named Daniel Horowitz, who really wanted to help get the word out about her kind of communist commitments that she tried to more or less hide. He was insisting on like letting it be known that who she is, she's an intellectual, all these things. I'll have to leave the story for you to track down later, but Friedan is well known when you can find an honest account of her life that she really echoed Marx and Engels, saying that women would only be truly free when they would enter the paid workforce. She saw that women were not doing this voluntarily, interestingly still. They needed coaxing, or you might call it guilt and manipulation, and a good shove through a kind of a communist framework, even in America, which was taking root, especially in universities. In the 30s through the 60s, in our, many of our elite institutions, and we're going to come to a couple of names that were key in that time. But Friedan she sought to convince American women they'd be happier in the workforce. And this gets into, we're going to now dovetail briefly into something that Carl Trueman, another book plug, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Carl Trueman writes that it was in this period that Nietzsche and Marx, after coming along, they say history is about power and oppression, right? So that even the notions of human nature are just constructs designed to reinforce and perpetuate our subjugation, women's subjugation in particular. And oppression is built on repressive sexual codes that maintain patriarchal nuclear family as the norm, right? And so when you frame this all negatively, they were writing that monogamous, chaste marriage with traditional Christian views of marriage is an oppressive force. In fact, Christian morality should be seen as immorality dressed up as righteousness, right? And this is what's going on in the communist framework, right? And so the traditional patriarchal, again, father-ruled family is simply put a unit of oppression.
Yeah, and you see this kind of language, even you could call it propaganda, that's being played out in this time. Statements, outlandish statements like comparing homemaking to a comfortable concentration camp,
Right.
for example, so extreme, and other things like Frederick Engels, who basically said the family turned women into chattels, essentially, and virtual pieces of property, and their emancipation would come about only when they were allowed to take their place as workers in the public means of production, end quote. Or in other words, women are slaves until they're freed to work, and I'm just going to add, like men.
Right. Right. That was a big part of, again, you see the communists, well, they would call it socialism back in the day. We can comfortably call it communism now, the absolute control of the government over every part of your life, including the family's life. And you need every adult body to be a worker in whether that's factories or offices or whatever it is. And so women who decide to bear children, the government is effectively, and all over the world, but America more and more as well, was seeking to get women back into the workforce as soon as they could, as soon as they were physically able. And so government interventions, whether that be through education, whether that be through, government centers, childcare, all of this, the push, we're summarizing things that took decades to become popularized.
Well, right. And I think the other thing we haven't mentioned yet, but is in this background, is the shift to the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
Where work was leaving the home. And that was a very new development. It's kind of weird as I was reading and thinking through all this stuff. First of all, the Marxist connection was fascinating, but also the Industrial Revolution dynamic was fascinating in that really before, the 1800s?
Yep.
No human being knew the kind of life that is so normal to all of us that, you go out to work versus basically working in and from your own residence, right? And a very predominantly sort of agrarian society kind of thing where you were developing and making and selling what you were, working off your land and out of your own means, essentially.
So here's a quote, just to, again, like, it almost sounds too good to be true, like feminism and Marxism, and you can dismiss this, but in 1955, I saw this quote from Mao Zedong. He was the first chairman of the Chinese Communist Party. Wrote this about women and communism. He said this, quote, "In order to build a great socialist society, it is of the utmost importance to arouse the broad masses of women to join in productive activity. Men and women must receive equal pay for equal work in production. Genuine equality between the sexes can only be realized in the process of the socialist transformation of society as a whole," end quote. And so that is just an outright again, Marxist agenda that is being pushed from China to the Soviet Union and into the United States. And I would just say, for the sake of time here, we're going to introduce another woman who was alive until 2017. By the way, Friedan, unless very, very recently, everything I've been reading, she is still alive. Betty Friedan is. But Kate Millett, 1934 to 2017, really is seen as the female Marx, even referred to as the high priestess of feminism. And she really managed to take advantage, as it were, of the momentum of what is sometimes called first wave feminism, and really is kind of the marker historically to a lot of people that she introduced second wave feminism. Now we're in the 1970s. As she's coming of age in terms of popularity, the sexual revolution's in full swing, second wing feminism and its writings and its philosophy and its political momentum as well is like gasoline on the early flames of the sexual revolution. You've got psychologists and sociologists like Freud and Kinsey, which we're not going to get into today, but they're writing, basically about sex and about unconscious desires, and all of these things create this melting pot. And Kate Millett is growing up in this. She was a product of Oxford and then Columbia. And Columbia is where Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School is now. If you pay attention to critical theory came over from Germany through Herbert Marcuse and others from Columbia in the 1930s and on. And so she was trained under him. She was a lesbian. She was inspired by someone named Marquis de Sade, who had come up earlier in research, but we're not going to go into him right now. So she's influenced by him, lived a lesbian lifestyle. Marcuse, and it is said that Marcuse was to Millet what Marx had been to Frieden. And so you've got these influences of communist writings and Marxism and all of that propaganda. And Marcuse, again, one of the fathers of critical theory, critical race theory, critical other theories. It's a whole branch of sociological study, saying, though, that at a fundamental level, the structure of American society, especially its sexual norms, like monogamy, were enslaving.
Mm-hmm. Cue the sexual revolution.
Yeah.
Really.
Again, just
it was
gasoline.
developing already, but it was, gasoline on that fire. Wilhelm Reich was another member of the Frankfurt School. He's the one that coined the term sexual revolution in a book by that name. And he saw the family could be reworked to be an asset for the communist revolution. And the more a family embraced free love and sexual freedom, the more it could be counted on to work for the revolution. And so obviously you're preaching these ideals. You're not only preaching it, you're pushing it, like we've been talking about. And so you're seeing this force that it's coming with, right? Millet would talk about the ideal of lesbianism really took hold of feminism, essentially. And the best feminists, she would say, were, in fact, lesbians.
Because you don't want men in your life.
Right.
And so you seek love through women.
Exactly. A quote of that is that the lesbian, through her ability to obtain love and sexual satisfaction from other women, is freed of dependence of men for love and sex and money. You don't need to depend on them, right? Freed from fear of unwanted pregnancy and the pains of childbirth and the drudgery of child raising. You get the sense, but you get the antagonism towards this, right? And then they're empowered even more with some of the things that, developed in terms of the pill, for example, in terms of abortion and other things, which made now pregnancy no longer something to overcome. They were using, again, and this is a big piece of the rise of the expressive individual, right? What a lot of Carl Trueman talks about is this idea of how technology ends up playing into this as well. Right. Because technology begins to allow man to play the role of God. Yep. They can recreate things and recreate the way God had designed, for example, women to function, giving birth and bearing children and all of these kind of things. Now we can get rid of that enslavement that it's called, those social pressures that are placed upon women. And of course, that's all they see it as, nothing more than that, right? Not embedded in creation, not part of God's design. And so the whole house continues to crumble down.
Yeah. Continuing on just this theme regarding abortion and feminism, Millet was a huge advocate of abortion on demand. She said this, quote, "Abortion was the primary," this is what Carrie Gress says, "abortion was the primary way to equalize women and men because women were no longer saddled." Imagine viewing that in that way, right? No longer saddled, I'll continue, with an unwanted child and the years of dedication that motherhood requires to raise that child. Millet, in fact, said the patriarchy is the most pervasive ideology of our culture and provides its most fundamental concept of power. Patriarchy was inescapable in society's configuration, and so that was public enemy number one was patriarchy in the family, and so the family needed to be dismantled, and she was exceedingly successful in so many ways, even though what you see through the thread line, Scott, and there's so many women we have not mentioned as well that were a part of this, but the sorrow and the trail of tears and devastation and brokenness. In fact, in some circles, these women are called the lost girls. Some of them became the mean girls, right, who boss and bully others into compliance, but others were the lost girls. Their souls were just devastated by their ideologies, and abortion becomes this preeminent, again, intertwined. You've got you've got French Revolution, Enlightenment, Romanticism, Marxism, critical theory, and you've even got the intertwining of slavery in the middle of the 1800s, right? And so what is feminism, again, is just difficult to define on its own because it is now involved in so much of other ideologies. But Roe versus Wade, 1973, this becomes the invented right to abortion, which just became... so quickly by the 90s, abortion goes from something that was theoretically supposed to be rare, right, and only in the event of absolute need, and it became the championing of what women, feminists were believing in was the fundamental human right to make sure that pregnancies could be terminated so that you basically had no difference between you and the working man. If you did not want that to be saddled, again, that language, which is so devastating, honestly. Enter now in the 70s, Gloria Steinem, the co-founder of the Ms. magazine, MS, the Ms. magazine in the 1970s was wildly popular. It was very unique for its time, but the fear tactics that were made by women such as Steinem around birth and birth control and the fear about, again, the patriarchy and all of these realities, and we haven't even really gotten into Margaret Sanger, who is really the foundress of Planned Parenthood, and there's so much that could be said there. But boy, the wave of devastation in these key figures' lives, but also the many nameless women who are subject to this devastating ideology just continue to pile up in the 1970s and beyond.
Yeah, and I think it was Sanger that coined the term birth control.
Yep.
And of course, birth control is key to understanding how homosexuality went from being unacceptable to being pretty much actively embraced by American culture, right? Sexuality was always tightly connected in people's minds with kids.
Kids, yeah.
Fertility, right? Sex meant kids. With birth control's arrival, sex no longer had to include children. Now it could be only about pleasure and about uniting a couple. And of course, that makes way for people to be in a kind of relationship and have a kind of sex that didn't produce children. And people just began asking, what's the big deal? How is their sex any different from ours? This is what it is at its fundamental level. It's about pleasure, and really it's about the self getting what the self wants, and anything that enslaves the self in a way that the self doesn't want to be so-called enslaved is a bad thing. And so I can't help but thinking, even Chris, of what you said earlier, which is, man, there are so many threads in this. And I think of like the snowball thing, right? And you mentioned that earlier. How do you make a big snowball? Well, you take a little bit and you roll it down a hill, and before you know it, it's attached so much snow to itself that you've got this massive thing. And it just struck me, and this isn't the context of 1 Corinthians 14, but we get a clear description of what God's like. It says, "For God is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace." And I can't help but think some of the issue with feminism and how it's sprung up in the ways that it's so embedded into our life is through the opposite. It's through confusion. Right? It's through unrest that's being created by sinful people, certainly at the behest of Satan's great, and his involvement in that. And so it's interesting. So if you're following us and you're going, okay, I got this and I got that and I got this and I got that, I actually think that's part of Satan's design and why it's been so effective in the first place.
And yeah, very, very well said. And that transition, abortion, free sex without consequences, does start to become, whether it's homosexual sex or heterosexual sex, what really is the difference?
Right.
Because if children don't need to be the product of sexual intercourse now, commitment and the covenant of marriage and all of this, you do actually have a pretty direct line to feminism and LGBTQ alliances, right? We already mentioned lesbianism, which was held up as the ideal of what a feminist could be. Not all feminists became lesbians, but all lesbians were feminists, and that's also a quote and a summary from Carrie Gress. And so you've got some other people here that really, you know what, probably not worth worrying about all of the names at this point, but just understand that this is how the kind of commingling of so many ideologies come together. They're breaking free of conventional sexual norms, breaking free of marriage and monogamous marriage, breaking free of biology,
Gender,
what
sex.
males are made for, what females are made for in God's order, His good order. And there's a continual advocating just women as humans. We talked about that from the very beginning. Remember Sithna? The ideal woman is just human, and it's more androgynous. And you start to get into the meaning of the body can really be it's not determinative. Your organs in your body are not determinative of who you are any longer, and you do very truly start to get into both philosophical and now cultural arguments for transgenderism. And we're going to just leave it kind of at that to understand that these are all, whether they are dominoes or whether they were inevitable, I would say this, it's the logical outworking. It's not like oops, couldn't have guessed that, or surely no, this is the logical outworking of a different religion, the inversion, as we'll talk about a little later, of God's created design and order, that feminism gets to transgenderism, which, don't you know it, actually erases women altogether. Because now now men are better women than women. And that's not sarcasm or an over-exaggeration. Magazines celebrating biological males as the woman of the year, and seeing biological males enter female sports and just dominate, and seeing the confusion around this. And feminism is a major player. We're not going to isolate it as the only reality, but it's a major player of how you actually have feminism erasing women.
Of course, which is so ironic, but not surprising.
Right.
That's what idolatry does. That's what flipping
Yep.
God's design, God's order does. And we know this, right? Romans 1 is built off the premise that we neither honored God nor gave thanks to God, but essentially our worship was inverted.
We exchanged
the glory of God for created things and began to worship and serve created things instead of the Creator, who is to be forever praised. Amen. And anytime you do that, and again, it's always shrouded in nobility, right? If you go back to some of the points you were making about Wollstonecraft and what she was trying to say about women with more education, right? Who'd argue about that, Chris?
Right.
That seems noble. Well, hello, this is how lies work. It works because there's a lot of truth in it. There's a lot of things that seem like it's making movement forward. There's a lot of, this is progressive in the positive sense, right? And so it gets covered up in some of this, some of even the positive ways of how that would be embraced by people across the board who wouldn't want women to have an access to greater education, right? That doesn't seem bad.
Right.
Becomes a covering, in a sense, for this insidious ideology that begins to make its way through and stays just as much behind those kind of ideas as confuses you with where its origins really are. And it's really an amalgamation of a whole bunch of things, right? But at the foundation, it's idolatry. And so when you think about Genesis 1-3, you think about the Stanton's Women's Bible, it's a shifting of the story. It's an inversion, right, of the creation narrative. It's an inversion of man as God instead of God as God. And when you do that, it's some version of destruction, no matter how noble your purpose is, which I think feminism would say it was to free women, and it ends up destroying them.
Yeah. And so there is, well, that took quite a while. Trust us, please. There's so much more to be covered and so much more to be actually dwelt upon. I do think if you go through the book End of Woman, you'll be stunned at how these threads come together historically, philosophically, religiously. We're going to call that enough for now and get into some of the cultural, political impact and the inversion of creation. Feminism's foundation, right, is that inversion of creation from Genesis 1 to 3, rewriting it. Romans 1, the exchange in idolatry that is made. We can say this also, feminism seeks to recreate humanity, not in the image of God, right, where it's this idea of what's called essentialism, and feminism would reject essentialism, that being biologically male is an essential part of one's identity. We would say made by God, male and female, he created them. And so to be born male, to be born female is no longer, says feminism, essential. What's essential is what you identify as. And again, Carl Trueman's Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self will be a good read there. Feminism seeks to move teleology, right? That's the goal, the big picture. Move your purpose, or again, your goal. Move that out of the picture. Rather than having intrinsic meaning under God, there is no God, or you are God, and so we can recreate ourselves using technology, using medicine. We have the ability to be anyone, right? We wish to be, and transgenderism is taken to the logical extreme. It is connected.
Yeah, another cultural political dynamic is that feminism feeds off of hatred for men. And I think there's plenty of ways that we could give examples to that. And it's right to say that, again, this insidious kind of ideology is shrouded in things that have happened that are bad. Right? Women have suffered at the hands of men, and that is devastating, and that is horrifying. And it's so sad how women have been treated by, frankly, too many men, right? But the answer to that is not to hate men, remove men and their rule as God has designed it, emasculate them entirely. I mean, man as men in general, not that individual needs to be addressed, right? Those that are abusing and misusing the rule that God has entrusted to them as males made in the image of God. But the actual answer is not to emasculate them. It's a call for men to be men who follow Christ and walk in a way to honor the role that's been given to them humbly, gently, graciously, not mistreating, not abusing women. All that is obvious, right? But that
it's a shame we have to say it.
It is a shame that we have to say it.
Era in which we are in, where we have to. Another way that of just the continual impact of feminism, it uses emotionally manipulative tactics instead of arguing facts and truth. So repeatedly in this book, End of Woman, but man, you just see it all over the place. It was so illuminating to me when she wrote how they use smiles and euphemisms, right? So smiles, they make it look so
like it's great,
pleasant, it's so good. Women are so happy living in this life, in charge, doing right. They use smiles and they use euphemisms to mask the evil, right? That is, they call abortion women's health care, phrases like my body, my choice, reproductive rights. Again, those are euphemisms for the murder of children in the womb. And abortion has such a religious commitment on broadly the left. And granted, you do have, unfortunately, Republicans who embrace abortion to a certain extent, but it really has such a religious fervor and commitment that it would not, in my opinion, be wrong to use the Old Testament just like terminology of child sacrifice. It is a blood sacrifice that the feminism movement holds to. It's a necessary part of their worldview, that to be free is to be free of the requirement to ever be a mother. And so that this is how committed they are to it. But the euphemisms, the redefinition of words, or the obfuscation of what's actually happening with abortion. And it's not only abortion, for the record, it's other things too, sexual morality of all kinds being reclassified.
Yeah, I think even just a subtle maybe version that's just hitting me right now is that, I don't know if you've heard this before, but like that idea of I can't just be a stay-at-home mom.
Right.
I have to have done something. I needed to have gotten a degree, something meaningful and purposeful, and then I can fall back on being a mom. And that was some of the best thinking, and of the time, even of the generation I grew up in. I felt like I heard that before from different people. That you can't, there's a lacking dignity that has just permeated the culture, even on a low key level, that doesn't demand being a feminist, but explains and expresses the effect of feminism far broader than I think a lot of people even recognize. And so, speaking of permeation and just the pervasiveness of it, of course, it's not stopping in the political cultural dynamic. The effects of feminism have certainly reached the church and have reached the church in pretty clear measure. There's a great book on toxic masculinity where Nancy Pearcey breaks this down, and it is fascinating.
Yeah, why don't you get into that? It's great.
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, when you start to see, and this is where another component I mentioned earlier, but we haven't talked about much, is the effect of the Industrial Revolution and the progression of feminism, and how you have this shift that end up taking place in churches where you have some big changes take place. First of all, virtue becomes kind of a feminine trait, or virtue in general is something that's feminine, and you had a lot of men who essentially got off the hook for certain responsibilities and a level of ownership that as leaders they should take that they were not taking, and really the church wasn't helping in. And so you see a lot of this, and it's even true of the tone of American evangelicalism, or even to this day, just on a practical level, it attracts a lot more women than it does men,
right?
Because it's still kind of pulling from the church 100 plus years ago being predominantly women that it was attracting in general. And so you've got different things in a work, feminization of American culture. You've got Ann Douglas saying that the church ministry lost a toughness, a sternness, an intellectual rigor, which our society then and since has been accustomed to identify with masculinity. And so when you think about that, it's not hard to understand then that the 19th century pastor was essentially pastoring in a world of women. Men began to neglect their responsibility for religious teaching in the home, and we talk a lot about family worship and the importance of men leading in their homes. The church was beginning to be redefined in terms of your emotional experience. Think about playing off of the romanticism. Think about how that cues women's interest. And, the Christian faith came under just a lot of intellectual attacks with the rapid growth of science. And so instead of standing up to those things, it sort of
kind of anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, and went the feels route instead.
Right.
And to the point where it really became, to act like a Christian, men had to deny their masculine nature in order to do that. It wasn't a place where you were going to be inspired to be a man following Christ as much as you should be inspired, encouraged to be a woman following Christ. It was like it started to be kind of, for a number of different reasons, just kind of fall below the surface of the emphasis of the church at the time.
Yeah, that's important. And just as one consequence among the feminization and emasculization of men in church and in church ministry, female pastors in this context make a lot of sense culturally, and I say in air quotes, culturally makes sense when we understand this drive, this impulse has been running rampant for such a long time, and we don't have to say a lot more about that. We're not a church, of course, nor you and I personally, that hold to an egalitarian. That's what it would be called. Egalitarian ministries would say that women are able to be pastors as well as men, but that's not what you see in Scripture. That's not what you see in church history, at least faithful church history, until very, very recent times. And I don't think a defense is going to be made here for that, but just this is the air that theology has grown up in as well. So, Scott, I feel like it would be important that we give enough adequate time to say what is maybe not the answer to feminism, as if we're going to do this all in one sitting here, but let's answer and try to help a Christian who, man, a lot of this might be new to you historically, thinking through it culturally, the web that is involved in feminism. And so what are some of the ways we wish to equip people to answer the feminist ethos and, again, air that we breathe?
a robust knowledge theologically, expositionally, in terms of understanding and explaining Genesis 1 to 3 in particular. So many of the issues, and really so many of the issues that feminism sort of influences and spreads into. You talked about LGBT and all of that stuff. A lot of it, amazingly, nearly all the core doctrinal issues of feminism are addressed in the creation account. So do we know that text well? Do we understand the implications of what happened at the fall? Do we understand? Because what you're going to be fighting against is the implications of someone flipping the story. Even if you're not hearing it in that setting or context, it's coming from whether it's the women's Bible, whether it's the stuff we talked about earlier. And as a result, we need to reject it because it's a rejection of the way God's designed things to be at the most fundamental level of creation. And I think you need to see it that way to be able to understand just how insidious this ideology is and what it's seeking to undermine. And I think always, like, we've talked about this before, but the best way to establish something that's a counterfeit idea, is to know the truth really, really, really well. And so, man, it makes me excited. We got to get to Genesis at some point, right? Preaching that. Even just to take Genesis 1 to 3 could be an extensive time together, because it is so important to re-embrace the doctrines of creation that are found there.
And within that, I would include rejoicing in the distinctions that God has made between male and female, men and women, biological, right? But guys, listen, it is not just the body parts that separate men and women. We have believed that for far too long. There is a fundamental distinction, not a difference in value, image bearers of God, but a distinction biologically, psychologically, socially, emotionally. In other words, in really all the ways that God has hardwired. Yes, there's overlap, right? This isn't to say difference without any similarity, but it's to say distinctions is a gift of God.
Yeah.
And that men need to, and I would move into this, we need to rejoice in who God's made you to be. So men, rejoice in being male. Worship God with thankfulness that you were made male. Ladies, worship God with thankfulness you were made female. And this is beyond just like accepting it, right? This is where we kind of stop. Like, I accept that that's the truth. No. Rejoice that who you are is intentional by God. And it's something we are actually, I would argue, responsible by God, responsible to God to give him thanks for how he has hardwired us. But that's not just the body parts. It's again, the psychological, the social, the emotional, and it's not only cultural realities. I know there are cultural makeups, and this is not the time to flesh all of that out, but rejoice in who God's made you.
Yeah, I think find pleasure in what's pleasing to God, right? Find pleasure in the way God has done things. It's the Christian life, right? That's part of regeneration, new affections, new eyes to see the truth of not just the gospel, but the way God has designed things, and then to rejoice in those things. It can be part of your obedience to Paul, who says, rejoice always, right?
Yeah.
I think another thing is take it a step further. Make sure that rejoicing and being male or female spreads into the places of influence and in the domains that you have influence in, or you can influence. So men, this starts with you in the home, leading well, leading a life of sacrificial love, right? For the sake of your first wife, but your family, to show them the blessing of male leadership, that they would be flourishing, those under your care, right? Versus emphasizing the control piece, emphasize that when you're leading like Christ, people are flourishing under that care. And then ladies, continue to uphold those creational ordinances and patterns that God has designed. Continue to celebrate motherhood, celebrate being a mom. What a gift that is. And it's worth standing upon, and it's worth defending, and it's worth celebrating. And you guys, thank you. Thank you, faithful moms, for what you do. It is, watching my wife be a mom is one of the greatest joys of my life. I have been astounded by the way God has enabled her to, first of all, be an incredible mom, to raise these kids, but also the way she's taken the opportunity to disciple those kids in the home, and what an impact that is, but how many also things she does quietly that makes life function so well, right? And so there's this flourishing as men leading, and then there's a flourishing within that domain as women operate in that together. And it just fills out this really sweet opportunity to be reflections of here's how it works when God's good design is not just understood, but embraced, as you said, rejoiced in, and then lived out. It's gonna be, it's gonna be messy at times,
Right.
but it's a good thing to go after. And it's a good thing to have be your story of this is what we're going to be about. And so I think that's huge.
Yeah, yeah. So, Scott, we've got a long ways already on this episode, but we have not yet, we've mentioned the word patriarchy. We have not really mentioned it in the context of there's egalitarianism in the church, then there's complementarian theology, then there's patriarchalism, or we could just call it patriarchy. And among many conservative Christians, patriarchy is a term that, first of all, is a very old term, but it's having a bit of a resurgence in, I would say, recent years, more than I have really ever seen, at least. And many wanting to recapture this as it is the really only faithful way to respond to feminism is to insist on using the word patriarchy. And strictly speaking, pater arche, the Greek words, mean father rule, right? And that is exactly what it is on a fundamental level. The universe is indeed governed by a father. It is ruled by the heavenly Father. So we are in a patriarchal world, if you want to say it on a simple term. And yet, we've had a lot of conversation with this, right? I don't mind people wanting to use the word patriarchy, but would caution this. Unfortunately, you lose people if you use it right away without being able to give a positive vision for it. And complementarianism has been a word in Christian circles, John Piper, Wayne Grudem, and others since the 80s, bringing this men and women play complementary but distinct roles in church and in family and really in society ought to as well, complementary yet distinct. And many will criticize these days the word complementarian because there's such a soft complementarianism, they're kind of phony, and then others would say just go back to the real word of patriarchy.
Yeah, and I think where patriarchy is rightly embraced, like you said, in accordance with God's word, that we celebrate that, right? But we don't want to also just swing the pendulum to the other side,
Right.
where patriarchy itself is as abused as feminism, where it's like, here's what you do, here's what I do, you do the things I don't want to do, and don't ask me to do that because I'm the patriarch kind of idea, right? That's kind of a broad caricature, but as long as the men understand that you're leading, you're loving, you're sacrificially laying your life down, right? You're nurturing and cherishing your spouse. There is I think the issue is really the soft complementarianism, right? I think that's the issue. That what happens is complementarianism starts to erode because of some of these influences and becomes just functionally egalitarianism, right? So there's a need to hold up, call it what you want, strong complementarianism, or a biblical version of patriarchal father rule, father God first, and then how he's designed men to lead and those kind of things in the home, in the church, that rightly upheld is honoring to God, is the best good for his people, his church, and then ultimately that in society. And so there's a lot there in terms of but how do we deal with the society that we're in? And we're not going to be able to answer all of those questions with the time that we have, but we do want to say, this is a word that's coming up. This is a word that's been in a lot of conversations, as you mentioned. And while there's a genuine truth to it biblically, we want to make sure it stays in the biblical lane and not in the potential abuses that could come with it. And by the way, any word, any term could have its own abuses. And so our responsibility is to continue to go back to the Bible and let the Bible inform how we are to lead in these ways and how are we to, operate and how God's made us.
Yeah, my thought on the matter would be use the term or don't, but live the biblical expression of it, right? Like the Bible doesn't actually use that word in terms of what you have to call yourself as a Christian man, for example, or a woman who would believe in that, but just live that, the positive and biblical, God-honoring honoring expression of male leadership in home and church and society. Be that, especially to the men who want to uphold that or recapture that from a society that is largely, because of Engels and others who has so tossed that word in the trash heap of history. But actually, if you want to recover it, fine, but live the life that shows the godliness and the humility and the boldness and the strength, right? Even the quiet strength before you have to pound your fist on the table and say, you must use my word or not. And so that's maybe a word of caution, but I would say, men, live the life that would show, especially if you're a young man who's hearing this and reading a lot right now, live the life before you're like calling a woman to something. Be it yourself
That's
first.
good. Live it. Yeah, I like that. And I would just say, maybe my last thought, Chris, and then you can wrap us up here, is to say, what about those just impacted by the devastation of this ideology?
Mm-hmm.
What about saying, I don't have a male leader in the home. Here's my situation. It's been devastated by X, Y, or Z. Where do you start? What do you do? First of all, my heart goes out to those people. There's a lot of that, I think, out in the church and in broader Christian world. And the good news is that God has grace that can abound to that. And maybe for some it starts with repentance. Maybe that's not the issue, though. For some it may be repentance. Like, hey, I was operating a certain way. I was thinking a certain way. It's not in accordance with God's word, and I need to change my thinking, and I need to change my acting. Others, though, it's what do? I want that and don't have it. And I think that's where you do the best and trust God's grace for the situation that you're in.
Sure. Yep.
And God is able to work in that. And even, if you're thinking, oh, can he be pleased with that? I think God knows. I think God sees that stuff. I think grace can abound in that way. And in as much as you are able, because again, it's like, well, what if I have to take leadership, right? I'm the woman, and I'm not supposed to take leadership, but I'm the only one. Yeah, you have to take leadership. Right. And then while that's not the ideal situation, please know that the Lord's going to supply strength for that. Right. And that's not, and I don't want you to think of yourself as just I'm a horrible person and I can't believe the terrible decisions that were made. Trust the Lord, trust that he's not done writing your story, and where at all possible, operate within the realm that God has designed you to operate, and believe God for the flourishing that will come when you walk in the ways God's called you to walk.
Yeah. That's good. That's a great final word. And probably, listener, you may still be saying to yourself, man, I need more fleshed out. And who knows, maybe we try to flesh this out again. But we do hope that from the introduction historically all the way back to the French Revolution up to today, culturally, politically, in the church, and with a response, we hope this is an equipping. We hope this is an emboldening conversation. We hope this is an inspiring one to realize that the Bible puts forward the absolute best way, not only by God's intention, but under his authority to live a life to his glory. And we would say, get back in the word, seek to be that kind of man, seek to be that kind of woman, and recognize that, to your point, Scott, God's grace covers all the different places where we would say, less than ideal, not my story, don't know where to start. Start in trusting God and getting into his word and seeking that out. And so we hope this has been helpful. We always appreciate, as a last word, reviews and or comments being left in those reviews. You can find that on your Spotify store, Apple iTunes podcast store. Leave a 5-star review. If this is helpful, please share this with others. We appreciate the work that so many listeners do to get the word out and share with their friends. Continue that good work. We look forward to seeing you next week.
You've been listening to Doxalogic, a podcast by Doxa Church in Rockland, California. To learn more, visit us online at doxa.church.